Most of the knowledge of indigenous peoples is in languages that we don't speak. So, there's more than 6,000 languages on the earth. And generally, from the scientific world, we believe that languages evolve in specific contexts. So, on tropical islands, up on the top of mountains, in the middle of deserts. So, they're very specifically wired. But all that knowledge is the things that people know on a daily basis and things they talk about, but it's not written down. So it is a bit of a challenge. How do we bring that knowledge into discussion, into understanding, so that we can work together to find global solutions? So we have different interventions. I think our most important work is we help communities do their own research. So many of the people we work with, they've never been to school, but they know a lot. So how do they bring that knowledge forward? They do their own research. So we've just been working with nomads in Chad to document their knowledge about the weather and the changing climate. And then they meet with Chadian scientists and also with the government to talk about how to cope with climate change. And our job is to put together the scientists with the holders of this indigenous and local knowledge. And then they look at from their different angles, how they understand, for example, a mountain ecosystem, what are the changes, and then they give advice to the government on what is possible to protect that ecosystem. The opportunity with indigenous peoples is that their knowledge is so detailed, it's so specific. So, for example, working in the rainforest in the Congo Basin countries, there we don't have a lot of science about what are all the different plants, what are all the different species, but also how they're changing and interacting. But the indigenous people who live there, they see this every day, but their whole language is based on these systems. So they sometimes know the names of plants or animals that are not known well to the scientific community. We had one example on the Pacific Islands where there was a small rodent, well, not even a small rodent, a big rodent, living on one of the remote islands in the Pacific that had never been documented scientifically. And it was UNESCO that helped publish the first research done by the community. So first of all, there's lots of knowledge that needs to come to the surface, but it's also about problem solving. So if you think about climate change, in the urban area, you have one experience, but on a mountainside or in a desert or in an ocean environment, it may be very different. So part of the job is to bring the people with the knowledge from all these very special areas to speak also with the national government. And otherwise, their issues are going to not be known. And you can't address what you don't know. So there's a process of translation from the indigenous knowledge into the national language and the national discussion, but also to understand how, for example, meteorologists look at weather one way, but nomadic people or herders, they have a different experience of weather and changing climate. So how do they understand each other? They need to spend some time together, but they need some of the same tools as well. And that's a translation process, but it's also a learning process for both sides. And that's our job, is to help each side understand what the other needs to know and to build partnerships. I think our work really focuses on first of all, the conservation of biological diversity. We know that human society exists because we have natural resources, fresh water, fresh food, but also things like medicine that comes from the bush. So those are already resources that are the foundation of human existence, but they're also the foundations of other species' existence as well. And so by protecting the knowledge, we also are looking at the custodianship. So this is, I think, an important concept. So it's not just about knowing something, it's about taking care of something. For example, an endangered species, like I can think of the redneck ostrich in northern Niger in the Sahara. There was a time where the redneck ostrich was going to disappear. Scientists had documented it, but who was going to do something? And so the local Tuareg people, they helped bring the male and female ostriches together, protect them, allow them to have their babies, and release them back into the wild. So this was an example of how indigenous knowledge and science could work back to help protect the environment. The knowledge that emerges from the LINKS program Some of it is published, and we put it on our website, and you can download that. Or we did a fantastic project with the Mayanga people in Nicaragua, where they developed school materials using indigenous knowledge of documenting all the different forms of life in the river system in north central Nicaragua. So that's now taught in school. So previously, that knowledge wasn't documented, but also it wasn't available for the school. So through a process of community research, they produce all those materials. We have another set of materials that are only just starting to be used, but they're already being shared a lot, and that's on the traditional knowledge of Pacific Islanders about how they do open ocean navigation, but also their understanding about the ocean, about the swell, the shapes of the waves, the different species in the Pacific Ocean. So there's lots of material, and some of it we publish. But our key role is not that. Our key role is to bring the people together with the scientists so they can understand each other, and that goes into big assessments. So that goes into scientific reports that help guide the government on decision making. So we do that through the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, a very long name, IPBES, but IPBES provides key reports to the international community on the changes in biodiversity. We're very excited that the UN has launched the International Decade on Indigenous Languages, and very proud that UNESCO is the lead agency to help that process. We believe it's a big breakthrough that to make the connection about languages and knowledge and the environment is a way to valorize the complexity of the indigenous knowledge system. So I remember years ago, when I said I was working on languages and endangered languages in Southern Africa, they said, oh, those languages must be very simple. But actually the languages I was working with Ngu, but there was also Khong and Kham and other languages in the area. These are the phonetically most complex languages on earth. So, for example, English is quite a complex language in its sound, but the languages I was working with, whether it's Ngu, but also Xuthuansi in the north, these are 3 times more complex than English in their sound system. And that is used to provide a great deal of detail on the biodiversity of the Kalahari ecosystem. So you're constantly dealing with prejudices from the outside about what is so sophisticated that it's often hard to relay to someone who doesn't know. So I'm always a bit amused that people often say, so what is the word in your language for nature or tree or whatever? So in the community where I was working, the elders, they were laughing with me one day. They go, you know, Nigel, we don't even have a word for nature in our language. We use a European word for it. But why would you distinguish between where you live? You are nature. You are part of nature. So why do you people, basically you foreigners, why do you have another word for this thing? You are it. It's part of your world. But also in their language, for example, you couldn't use a generic word for a tree. So you may have the same experiences that I do. If you ask people in an urban area, in Paris or sometimes in Cape Town, what is this tree? They'll look at you and like, it's a tree, it's a tree. They don't really even know the species, let alone its functions. Whereas in the Kalahari Desert, in this language, you cannot talk generically. You have to talk about the species and even the functionality of the tree. So this is the level of precision that exists in indigenous languages, and that can help us understand the world. So if we know that a tree has different functions at different points in its life, if we know that a tree supports a whole ecosystem of its own, then we begin to have more respect for that tree. When we were working in southern Chad, we did a whole mapping exercise with Mbororo pearl herders. And right near the end of the mapping, the elders began to show us individual trees. So that's interesting, a big map like this, and then they start to tell us individual trees. But I said, why? They were a bit shy about it at first. And then they said, well, listen, some trees have good spirits, and some of them have negative spirits. And you mustn't let your children play under a tree with negative spirits. So this is quite an interesting concept. So why do they have this idea about these trees? They are remembering trees that are hundreds of kilometers away, the individual tree they can recognize. So then we realized that all of these are fruiting trees, and they all play a really big role in that Sahelian environment. So here was an example of an indigenous language system and knowledge system that will really tell you about the soil and the water and the species in the Sahel. So this is what we believe is the great opportunity. How can the language decade help tell those stories and valorize our responsibilities and our opportunities in terms of nature? I think some interesting examples are maybe the simplest thing is just realizing that with my education, with my career, with whatever, if I'm in the Congo Basin, or if I'm in the mountains in the Andes, or if I'm in the Kalahari Desert, I cannot just get up and walk for the next 3 weeks and be okay. I basically won't survive. And I'm sitting next to a grandmother or a grandfather who can do that. They can get up and they can walk across the landscape for 3 weeks, and they will live. They will find food and water and shelter, but have relationships with the land. These indigenous people have ways of living in the world and moving in the world that is informed by a lot of detail, but a lot of precision, a lot of observation. I've watched elders pick out just the movement of a leopard's tail at hundreds of meters from us, just moving near a sand dune. So the observational capacity. But the person who probably inspired me the most or a lot was a man called Karol Kleinman, who was a San, indigenous Komani man from the Kalahari. And he said to me, we were out in the bush following tracks. He was a tracker trainer. He was one of the great, he was a master tracker, a brilliant man. And he said to me, Nigel, everything that can do you good and everything that can do you harm has already left a mark. But it's up to you if your eyes are open and you can read the sign. And I realized that he was telling me probably one of the most important lessons in my life. So it's about the skill to observe, about the ability to be quiet and let the facts speak to you. But also there's another thing, and every indigenous group I've ever met, I see this with them. It's expertise, it's knowledge, but it's also understanding. There's a feel for what is happening. So if there's something dangerous, people feel it before it happens. They have a sense that there's something going on. And I think this is something that in the Western urban cultures, we really are disconnected from, that we don't know how to listen to our own inner voice, as well as pay astute attention to the signs that are around us. So what I learned from Karol Kleinman was, open your eyes, be quiet sometimes, and pay attention, and you can figure out which path you need to be on. The challenge is that in dealing with climate change, biodiversity loss, ecosystems, conservation of the environment, you need the detail. You need to know the local. So I'll give you an example. A lot of what meteorologists are able to produce is not really usable for people in Africa or Asia or the Pacific or other parts of the world. It's not that it's not valuable science, but it's too general. The scale is not the right scale. And we experience this a lot in the LINKS program in the dialogue between nomadic herders and meteorologists. Meteorologists could tell you very generally what was going to happen. They were using, like, for example, sea surface temperatures. So they're using sea surface temperatures from the Pacific Ocean to tell you what the weather will be like in Africa. But the precision is low. It's useful, but it's low. Whereas we found that the pastoralists, we worked at 6 different sites in Africa. The pastoralists had generated more than 1,000 indicators to observe weather changes and climate patterns. And that included the insects, the birds, the flowering of trees, the movement of different species. They had so many details, how the sky looks at night, the changes of the moon. You can call some of that cultural or mythological or magical, but there was a method that was very precise in it. So when we finally got the meteorologists and the pastoralists together in East Africa, what the meteorologists said to us is, we don't understand microclimates. We know for sure there are microclimates in East Africa, but we don't have the scale to tell us that. And the pastoralists are like laughing. They're like, we live there. We know exactly why there's a microclimate. We can tell you where and why. But what we also realized is we had pastoralists, Maasai pastoralists from Tanzania. In their language, they have words for all the different cloud patterns and all the different rain patterns. They're out there in the veld, in the bush every day for their whole life long. So for 4 years, the Tanzanian pastoralists realized a certain cloud pattern that should form had not formed. So that was technically very important for the meteorologists. But then we realized that the Maasai way of understanding weather patterns stretched all the way from southern Tanzania right onto the border of Ethiopia. So we were not talking about a small area. And the linguistic system linked that together. If you look at a language like Inuktitut, the language of the Inuit, it spreads all the way from Alaska right to Greenland, and people can, even though they speak different variants, they can actually understand each other. And their knowledge about ice and snow and weather patterns is very important and has now been included by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in the new Arctic special research. So personally, I don't think there's any evidence that there is a problem about the relationship between science and indigenous knowledge. They work at different scales for different purposes, but they're very complementary. So our question is just how to make that work. So we do know, sometimes indigenous people say, this tree is my ancestor, or this tree is sacred to my family, or my umbilical cord is buried here. I think scientists can understand that. I think scientists can say that you could have a love so profound for a tree that you feel it is part of your family. If that doesn't make sense to you in science, don't worry about that. You know, let people have their value systems, because it's all about life. It's all about wanting the world to be well. We come from different historical experiences. We speak different languages. We have power differential. Let's be realistic about that. The future of this planet is protect biological diversity through cultural diversity. Let us work together. The complexity is what makes us wonderful and makes the whole thing work. I gave the example that a grandmother in the Kalahari said to me, one of her community people said to her, grandmother, what do we need for our sustainability? And she said, we need the land, we need fresh water to drink, but also we need the truth. We need to tell the truth to each other. And sometimes it's difficult to hear that. But then later the grandmother said, you know what, we also need the idea we need solidarity. We need to care for each other. And this is probably the most difficult thing, is all indigenous cultures I've ever come across have a way of putting the ego to one side and being inclusive, being embracing of the world. And I think this is our big challenge at the moment. So to trust each other and to want to work together. That sounds a bit philosophical, but maybe philosophy is part of the solution. So one has to look at it within a time frame. So obviously the experience of colonization and colonialism, we went through a whole period where people lost autonomy, they lost rights, sometimes they lost territories, there were big impacts. Much of the 20th century was a process of trying to start to recover from that. And that included independence of states that had been under colonial rule, the creation of the United Nations, but also this crafting of a framework to recognize the specifics of the needs of indigenous peoples. So it took 25 years to negotiate the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. But since then, since 2007, we're seeing a change at an unbelievable rate. So all major UN instruments that deal with the environment have now included indigenous knowledge. And UNESCO, I'm pleased to say, was really a catalyst in this process, and we're a partner in the process. So the first major one is the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, IPBES. So every one of the IPBES assessments, thematic, technical, regional, includes indigenous people's knowledge within that. Big breakthrough. That provides guidance to governments all over the world. But now we're working with the Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services Network, BestNet, and now we're working at national level in developing ecosystem tools using science and indigenous knowledge. But look at the UNFCCC. Here in the city of Paris, we adopted the Paris Agreement, l'Accord de Paris, which includes recognizing indigenous knowledge as part of national adaptation strategies. And UNESCO is working with different member states on actioning that, making that work. So this year, for example, both Chad and Niger submitted their national adaptation plans involving indigenous knowledge. We're also seeing a big change in Latin America around the framing of the idea of protected areas. So you also know that UNESCO has more than 1,700 designated sites, World Heritage, Biosphere Reserves, and geoparks. So now UNESCO is working with many countries in Latin America on what's called Iberomab. It's an approach to involve indigenous peoples and local communities in successful site management. So we're seeing changes everywhere. Climate change, biodiversity, ecosystem, desertification, all UN instruments. The new report on the cryosphere and oceans from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change includes indigenous knowledge. And to be modest, we're a small player in a big scene, but UNESCO's often been the catalyst. We've created the conversations, we've connected the people, we've shared the ideas, and we work with the whole of the UN family. So if you ask me, the change is radical, it's quick, it's important, and it's global. So many countries that even had some, complex relationships with indigenous people, now they're looking at new partnerships on water, on the environment, on climate. And I think we should be optimistic. I think we should say the change is now. We are part of the change. And to inspire people who are partnered with UNESCO to be actors in that process, to come forward, get involved, whether you're a scientist or a policymaker or a local knowledge holder, or whether you're indigenous people, UNESCO is a place where we can help you connect and help have an impact.